Phone check. 1, 2. The microphone check. 1, 2, 1, 2. The microphone check. I got my headphones tuned between two different AM stations, and my briefcase is full of declassified information. Declassified.
Good evening and welcome to News from Neptune for the 7th week of 2015. For almost 25 years, this program has been a spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media. First on a so-called community radio station, and when censored and locked out of there, welcomed, I'm happy to say, by the good folks at Urbana Public Television. I'm Carl Estabrook. Our program's name, News from Neptune, was chosen to honor Noam Chomsky, who has been talking sense about American politics for twice the quarter century we've been on the air. Chomsky has said that in the American media, either you repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true, and it will sound like it's from Neptune. This and previous editions of this program are archived on YouTube and posted to the Facebook page for News from Neptune, where you'll also find comments from viewers, articles that we've referred to, and further comments from us. I also can be reached at carl@newsfromneptune.com, and I'm happy to receive your comments. On this day, 70 years ago, in World War II, with German armies defeated, British and American bombers destroyed the city of Dresden, killing tens of thousands of people, mainly women and children. Dresden was a refugee center from the Eastern Front in the Second World War. It had over 1 million people, half of them refugees, and that was known to the Allies when they attacked the city, which had no military significance. Winston Churchill later distanced himself from the attack. Winston was a good man of getting out of horrible examples of military incompetence, which he had made his reputation on, Battle of Gallipoli in the First World War. Even though Churchill was in fact heavily involved in the planning of the raids on Dresden. American author Kurt Vonnegut's novel Slaughterhouse-Five is loosely based on his first-hand experience of the raid as a prisoner of war. In remembrance of the victims, the anniversaries of the bombing of Dresden are marked with peace demonstrations, devotions, and marches, and all of those are going on in Saxony today. To come to today, a friend, a Middle European woman who was a child when Dresden was destroyed, writes that now, quote, the capitals of the ruins of the European Union are Kiev and Athens. Does it seem significant to you that on the same day, Wednesday, 12 February 2015, Athens meets in Brussels to discuss the EU's economic war on Greece, and Kiev meets in Minsk to hear what is to be done about the EU's losing proxy military war in Ukraine? To me, it sounds like ding dong, the wicked witch is dead, close quote. I hope she's right. I'm not at all sure. It's Friday the 13th of February, and around the world, people are standing up against the immiseration of their lives, notably in Greece, in Donbass, and in Palestine. And in many cases, they're being killed for it. And we as Americans must shamefacedly admit that behind their oppressors, especially in those three cases, stands the government for which we are supposed to be responsible. A government administration thoroughly dominated by neoliberalism, the insistence that government service to the public must be curtailed for the profits of the 1%, and neoconservatism, the insistence that our government make war around the world for the profits of the 1%. Neoliberalism and neoconservatism, which dominate both political parties and the presidency, destroy the lives of the vast majority of our friends and neighbors at home and abroad. The late anarchist Carl Hess, who began his political life as speechwriter for Barry Goldwater, you can Google Goldwater if you have to, and whom I was privileged to meet, once observed, quote, sometimes the most revolutionary thing you can do is get to know your neighbors, close quote. My immediate neighbors tonight, in addition to you, are David Green and David Johnson, and we'll consider those three cases, Greece, Ukraine, and Palestine, and some others as well. Our format is to take turns suggesting stories that have been ignored or misreported, sometimes, if not often, even innocently, in the corporate media, and then ask our colleagues to comment on them. And David Johnson has the first story.
Well, Carl, I guess that's a pretty good synopsis of what's going on. I mean, it's interesting though, watching some of the independent news coverage, not the U.S. corporate media, of course, but various Counterpunch, Real News Network, RT, about this recent peace talks in Minsk, and it's really interesting because frankly they came to an agreement fairly quick, and it seems like Hollande of the Prime Minister of France and Merkel of Germany were pretty motivated to get something done. It appears that they don't want a protracted war that could possibly turn into World War III. Rightly so. What's amazing is that the Obama administration, didn't disavowed it more or less. Of course, didn't participate, which may have been a good thing, and basically just saying that they're going to, continue on wanting to arm the fascist government of Ukraine. I mean, this whole thing going on in Donetsk region, these people don't want any part of this fascist government in Kiev. They want their own autonomous states, because you have to understand that, of course, this is never reported by the corporate media in the United States, is that under this new structure in Ukraine, which, let's not forget, came to power in a coup. They overthrew a democratically elected government. This structure they have now with outright pro-Nazis in the government, who basically think that Hitler and the Nazis were the good guys in World War II, have a system set up to where they appoint governors for these different provinces and other means of control. And these people in the Donetsk region don't want any part of this. They're willing to compromise, either let them. They say either let us have our own autonomous country or let us have autonomy within the country of Ukraine, in which we have total control over our regions as far as our elected officials. I don't think that's too unreasonable of a demand, frankly. So this is just insanity. And of course, it's really not insanity, but it's calculated policy by the neocons and the neoliberals that control our government to basically want to risk World War III so that they can get control of this area of the Ukraine, the Donetsk, has a lot of heavy industry. It's also got a fair amount of natural resources, and this is why they don't want to let it go, and they want it under their control. I'm talking about, of course, the government in Kiev of Ukraine. Greece, it seems like Syriza, the party that was elected in the recent elections, despite something I'm a little disappointed in, the fact that they are going to go ahead and allow the privatization of the port at Piraeus.
Is that true? I've heard different things about it. Is it clear now that that's what's happening?
It seems like because the deal was
and affirmed.
Yes, I'm hoping that maybe they can reverse it, but evidently what I understand is with a Chinese company, and it seems like they want. I think that maybe the reason why they might be backing down on this deal was that not only was it cut by the deal was cut the previous government, but also they want to leave their options open, hedging their bets, so to speak, politically, that they might, in case worst case scenario where they'll have to leave the Euro zone, that they might need Chinese, investments and other assistance. So I think it might be a lot of a politically calculated move just in case, the worst comes to worse.
I think that's right. And even if they don't leave the euro, the possibility of subventions and support from China means that they're willing to negotiate with China at the moment. So I think that's probably the case.
Otherwise, Syriza, they've been doing everything they promised to do. They immediately started opening up food pantries, restoring people's cut-off electricity, raised the minimum wage, and it's
rehired fired workers.
Fired workers that work for the government. Yes, and also actually passed a pretty comprehensive immigration rights bill, in which they made any children of immigrants who were born in Greece citizens.
That's very important, given that the right in Europe is working on the immigration thing just as it is here, but that in Europe this is a real problem. When people can be told that their social problems depend upon the fact all those foreigners are coming into the country. I was delighted to see that Syriza took that bit of bull by the horns.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
My only concern is that, of course, the new economics minister, I'm sorry, his name escapes me at the moment.
Finance Minister.
Finance Minister.
Yanis Varoufakis.
Yanis Varoufakis.
We bring along an expert who can pronounce the name. I can't do it either.
I've learned a lot of long Greek names lately.
Yes, indeed.
Nice job.
I can dazzle you with them sometimes.
Okay.
You just did.
He made a statement the other day that Syriza was actually trying to quote unquote save capitalism, which to me is a little bit disturbing. However, I got to give credit where credit's due, and the fact is that they took immediate measures to offset the horrible effects of austerity. I've got to give them, A pluses and all that. So I guess time will tell how it works out.
I'm almost willing to give Varoufakis a pass on this. He refers to himself as a good second-rate economist, and he's an academic with no particular respect for academics, which comes from being an academic.
But he's also a politician with no particular respect for politics.
Exactly.
He thinks of himself as a man of principle, and I think he's the real deal in that regard. I think his pragmatism should be understood in that context, not in the context of someone who's in politics and doing whatever he can to get ahead. He doesn't want to be in politics.
I think
in other words.
I think that's quite right. I also think he has a quick tongue
Yeah.
and has a taste for paradox.
Yeah.
So I would see that less as a change in policy than as a quip almost.
And it's also remarkable and perhaps useful to him that not only does he speak obviously fluent Greek and fluent English, but fluent German apparently. So he can talk to a lot of people in their native tongue and maybe disarm them in some ways that he wouldn't be if he didn't speak their languages.
And I hear a good bit of irony in the remark, we're trying to restore capitalism. His whole point all along has been the machinations of capitalism that has put Greece into this problem. Yeah. Well, restoring capitalism will be a major reconstruct job, and I think that's what he has in mind.
Yeah.
You mentioned, David, I think that he's been, Doug Henwood has interviewed him more than once, I think.
14 times, actually. He compiled excerpts from 5 or 6 of those interviews going back 10 or 12 years in one of his most recent programs that can be listened to online or over through a podcast. So it's a good exercise to go through that litany and see where he has wound up from in terms of his own background.
Did you want to enlarge on that, David?
No, I think I've.
I just wanted to say that in the context of all these conflicts you mentioned, Carl, Israel, Palestine, Ukraine, Greece, I think what we see in common with them is that there are larger regional and global conflicts within which these are subsumed, in which the United States seemingly overrides the interests of the local parties, whether it be Ukraine, the European Union, and even Israel and Palestine themselves, in terms of our relationships, our larger relationships in relation to Middle Eastern energy resources, Iran, and the whole Russia-China axis, which within which the Ukraine conflict has to be understood. So it's and you might also ask, where is the United Nations involved in all this? I mean, of course we forget about that because it's a puppet. But we still should remind ourselves every so often that the United Nations is a puppet of U.S. interests and is always overridden by them. So therefore, within all of these regional and local conflicts, the UN is basically nowhere to be found except as a kind of relief agency, whether in Gaza or Syria or Turkey and so forth.
I agree entirely with that, and I think it's important to see that the series of trouble spots, to use corporate media language, that we're talking about. I listed 5 without much trouble this morning. All involve, finally, American policy, which sets the problem for the regional actors. Greece, Ukraine, Israel, Iran, we can add Iran to that, or if we want to separate it, Venezuela, where a coup was foiled this week, apparently, that the U.S. had backed. And finally, and perhaps most importantly for the UN, ISIS and the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. In all of these cases, it's American policy which is at stake, not just because we're Americans and we have to decide what the government that we're responsible for should be doing, and what it is doing is not good at all, but because the general situation is such that the American policy is determinative. And that's the reason that what the U.S. is doing in all of these regions, which is perfectly apparent to most of the people who live there, is hidden from most Americans by the machinations of corporate media. Our job here is to lift up the corner of the tent on some of the things that are being done here by the U.S. You got some responses to David on Ukraine and Greece?
Not beyond what I've said. I mean, I think the 2 words Saudi Arabia should always be thrown in there in the context of the U.S. interest in this global context, because ultimately that's probably a determinative factor in the larger context of energy resources. And so are the alliance between the United States and the royal family, the Saudi family, is as fundamental a fact in geopolitics as you can probably find.
And the oil politics are crucial, as they are, of course, not only in regard to Russia, but in regard to Venezuela and the U.S. attempt to recover the revolting South American continent, which is, I think, at a little distance what you see is happening there. And Venezuela, of course, is leading the way by its Bolivarian socialism, and that's the reason the U.S. Wants to destroy it.
Yeah.
Speaking of Latin America, it's really interesting how all of a sudden the Obama administration is in the process of normalizing relations with Cuba, but yet they impose economic sanctions and trying to foment a coup against Venezuela. How interesting, because Venezuela is a lot different country than Cuba in the sense that Cuba is more of a one-party state, where Venezuela has a multi-party democracy. So I mean, I find that interesting in and of itself. But also, let's look at Cuba here. They've been definitely already hitting snags. Cuba was put on the American country's terrorist list back in the 1970s. Why? Not because Cuba ever did any terrorist acts anywhere in the world, because Cuba supported the government in Angola's fight against right-wing rebels and the South African government. And this is the South African government at the time of apartheid. And in fact, if it hadn't been for Cuban involvement in Angola, and then later the actual outright war, which is an amazing buried fact of history here in the United States, the war between Cuba and the South African army in Namibia, if it hadn't been for the Cubans kicking the South Africans' rear end in that war, apartheid probably would have never ended in South Africa. That's why Cuba is on the terrorist list of countries. Now, if we want to talk about terrorism, let's talk about the bombing of a Cuban airliner in 1979 that killed some 70 people, done by some right-wing Cuban-American extremists who, after they were exposed who they were, sought sanctuary and was given sanctuary by the U.S. government in Miami. I mean, these were, this is the thing.
Support of terrorism.
This word terrorism has become so misused that it's hard, to even find a real definition for it anymore. Basically, as far as the corporate-controlled government we have, the word terrorist means anybody that opposes their economic or political policies, okay? But my definition of terrorism, which I think is a more accurate one, is any group of people or government that kills unarmed civilians, non-combatant civilians. Now, Cuba has never done that. The United States, on the other hand, I'm sorry to say, is continuing acts of terrorism to this day with its drone attacks and other acts of subterfuge around the world. But what's interesting about the Cuban-American negotiations right now is Cuba is, first of all, demanding to be taken off the terrorist list of countries that the United States has it on, and they want Guantanamo back, which the Obama administration has replied that they'll only take Cuba off a terrorist list if they meet some certain conditions, and second, they have no intentions of returning Guantanamo. Frankly, I think that would be the ultimate. This would be a twofer, in my opinion, if they would return Guantanamo to Cuba on the condition that Cuba takes these prisoners that are there that haven't been charged with any crime and that supposedly the Obama administration just doesn't know what to do with. Well, let the Cubans take them and make them Cuban citizens, you know, and provide them support. I mean, this would be an ultimate solution to both closing Guantanamo and further normalizing relations with Cuba.
Maybe worthwhile to talk a little about the question of what the Obama administration is actually doing vis-a-vis Cuba. With some of our liberal friends have said, you see, we told you Obama was a liberal, and there's your best example. He's making nice with Cuba. Well. I think at least should be examined a little more. It seems to me that the Obama administration's Cuban policy should be looked at under the rubric that the U.S. has no permanent friends, no permanent enemies, only permanent interests. And those interests are the maximization of the profits of the 1%, whether it's in Eurasia or in the Caribbean. And it seems to me that what the Obama administration is doing in regard to Cuba is looking at the fact that South America as a whole is slipping from its grasp, that a wave of independence is growing throughout the southern half of the hemisphere, and that the bellwether and the model for much of it has been Cuba. Now, the notion that the U.S. could somehow co-opt Cuba could remove the possibility that Cuba would stand as a model and a beacon for social progress in South America, I think motivates the notion that, hey, no permanent friends, no permanent enemies, just permanent interests. What can we do to support the American economic regime in the Western Hemisphere? And the best path, as it has often seemed to be in the past, is to make nice with the powers that are actually in place, that actually do have some power. The U.S. has not shown itself to be Bourbon-like, you know, a government that has learned nothing and forgotten nothing. It has learned what it had learned early on, that it wants to support its 1% directly and entirely, but the way to do it, that may change. And I think the Cuban policy is a result of that.
Yeah, there's a nice, rather brief interview on the ZNet website this morning with Noam Chomsky, and he's asked in this interview why he spends so much time talking about the New York Times and the New Yorker as opposed to, say, Fox News. And basically what Chomsky says, and he said this before, of course, is that he's interested in the extremes of liberal opinion. He often refers, in the context of the Vietnam War, he would refer to dovish opinion, like Anthony Lewis of the New York Times. And what he's saying is that he's fascinated by the idea of how the extremes of liberal opinion embodied, Carl, just what you've been talking about, which is still a strategic vision of the United States controlling the global economy on behalf of both our 1% and the 1% in other countries as well, as long as they're obedient to the United States. So, and this is a problem I think we have at all levels. Sometimes it's hard to know where the extremes of liberal opinion stop and where something qualitatively different in left opinion starts. And I think that's the kind of debates that we're having as we engage some of our local friends who identify with what are called progressive Democrats. We have to emphasize that, you know, you're on one side or the other. It doesn't mean that there's a lot of pragmatism on the left, as there is in Greece right now. But it's like if you keep lining up with Obama and keep imagining that what he's doing, putting it in the column of, oh, he's a good liberal now, he's the person we thought he was going to be. No, he's not. He's working for the 1%.
And Chomsky himself has said on a couple of occasions that finally the best way to control public debate on political questions is not to exclude opinions. In fact, it's to include two apparently opposed opinions, so long as they stay within the limits of allowable debate. Once you've done that, says Chomsky, then you can let the debate go on as furiously as you want between Fox News and the New York Times, say, because the borders are protected, because the limits of allowable debate are protected. You're not going to step outside of that and say something that's finally inimical to the American political system's support for the 1%. That's a strategy that seems to me to describe very accurately the political debate, the political debate, or rather lack of it, that we have in this country. The seeming political debate that we have in this country.
You know, Carl, it's amazing. I mean, really, you know, besides all these ideological labels, and a lot of them I wouldn't even call ideological, they're more kind of corporate media creations that try to, you know, pigeonhole people in certain categories and stuff. I mean, let's look at facts. I mean, that's what I try to do. I'm not the most intelligent person out there, but good Lord, I mean, I saw through Obama right from the very beginning. Yeah. I mean, when I saw who he was appointing to his cabinet, I mean, it was pretty obvious. And, you know, but I have to admit I was wrong about him in that regard, because frankly, he's turned out much worse than I expected. Much worse. And for a lot of these people I know who, some of them I consider, you know, friends, that are doing nothing but living in denial. They brush off all the facts, and they just keep continuing on having this fantasy that Obama and the Democratic Party is something it's not. I mean, it just frustrates me to no end. Look at the facts and go from there. In that regard, it's really interesting, because one of the big statements that was being made by a lot of liberal Democrats certainly after Obama got elected was, well, we have to hold his feet to this fire. They kept evoking the conversation between the African-American labor leader A. Philip Randolph with Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the early 40s, when A. Philip Randolph wanted Franklin Delano Roosevelt to desegregate the military, to start, and in particular, to hire African Americans for a lot of the defense industry jobs that were coming about because of the beginning of World War II. And the famous line that FDR said to A. Philip Randolph was, well, Philip, you're going to have to make me do it. And this is the line that these liberal Democrats kept saying, that's what we got to do with Obama. Well, what's interesting is when certain people in the, I would call populists, like the Fire Dog Lake, the one online and actual print newspaper that basically was trying to hold Obama's feet to the fire and start criticizing him and trying to force him to do the right thing. What happened? They basically, Obama's staff viciously attacked these people and called them firebaggers, as sort of a play on the word of teabaggers. I mean, this is the thing, is that, you know, Obama, you know, as far as telling somebody to make him do it, he's saying that to the Republicans, not to average working Americans and people who are populist. He has nothing but, his staff has had nothing but vile and viciousness towards anybody that's any remotely a populist that would want to actually try to force him to do something that's in the best interest of the American people.
I think it's important to say, to see that the Obama presidency, the Obama administration as a whole, is a result of the co-option of the anti-war movement and indeed the co-option of the left economic movement in this country. They knew perfectly well what they were doing. You can read about it in Obama's audition piece for the presidency, his book that I always slip and call the mendacity of hope. It's the audacity of hope. But in fact, it was a splendid exercise in mendacity, in lying. And in it, what he put forward was exactly a conception of the presidency that would avoid the pitfalls that drove two presidents from office in the 60s and 70s. And the way to do that was to follow a neoconservative and neoliberal agenda before most Americans even knew what those words meant. What those wars meant too, I'm afraid. And that's indeed what he did. And Chomsky himself said he wasn't disappointed in Obama because he never had any hopes for Obama in the first place, like you did. You're watching News from Neptune, and this is our program for the February 13th. David, you had a topic you wanted to bring up too, particularly, right?
Yeah, and actually I've referred to this in previous programs and been doing a little research on it. Kind of, it's in the air, I think, what with Rauner ascending to the governorship in this state. And this morning on Amy Goodman, she interviews at the end of the program a journalist named David Sirota about the public pension scandal that's ongoing in our country as part of the larger pension scandal, as part of the larger financial capitalism scandal, as part of the larger neoliberal scandal that all relates to what we're talking about here. Bruce Rauner is a man who, ironically, is opposed to public employees and public unions, but his private equity firm, upon which he became a billionaire, was heavily reliant on the investment of public pension money. That's come out in an article, for instance, this is already ancient business, but April 6, 2013, an article in Crane's Chicago Business, Rauner's love-hate relationship with pension funds. Like other private equity firms, which typically acquire companies in hopes of profiting when they sell them or make them public, GTCR, the R in that is for Rauner, has raised a significant portion of its money, perhaps the largest percentage, from public pension funds. They supplied half to two-thirds of the firm's funds by Mr. Rauner's estimate. The larger context of this, an article from September back in 2013 by the inimitable Matt Taibbi in Rolling Stone, yes. all across. Called Looting the Pension Funds. All across America, Wall Street is grabbing money meant for public workers. And Taibbi writes in this is a third act of an improbable effing of ordinary people that Wall Street is seeking to pull off as a shocker epilogue to the crisis era. 5 years ago this fall, he's speaking in 2013, an epidemic of fraud and thievery in the financial services industry triggered the collapse of our economy. The resultant loss of tax revenue plunged states everywhere into spiraling fiscal crises, and local governments suffered huge losses in their retirement portfolios. Remember, these pension funds were some of the most frequently targeted suckers upon whom Wall Street dumped its fraud-riddled mortgage-backed securities in the pre-crash years. Mm-hmm. And then a little later, back after Rauner was elected in November of last year, on the Intercept, the new online journal, Murtaza Hussain has written, Wall Street is taking over America's pension plans. He writes, Illinois, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island. Don't forget the Rhode Island elected also a governor, Gina Raimondo, who was heavily involved in the hedge fund equity, private equity aspect of our finance. All these states recently elected governors who were previously executives and directors at firms which managed investments on behalf of state pension funds. These firms are now consequently in position to obtain even more of these public funds. This alone represents a huge payoff on that $300 million investment made by the financial industry. He's talking in this article about the investment made in the campaigns and the political campaigns of these people, and is likely to result in even more pension money going into investments which offer great benefits to Wall Street but do little for the broader economy. And this article, Murtaza Hussain, refers to $3 trillion in public assets currently in pension funds throughout the country. That's a big chunk of non-1% liquid wealth.
Yes.
Almost a quarter, and almost a quarter of this $3 trillion has found its way into so-called alternative investments like hedge funds, private equity, and real estate. These are often called, this is also called the shadow banking sector. That translates into roughly $660 billion of public money now under private management, invested in assets that are often arcane and opaque, but that offer high management and placement fees to Wall Street financiers. And then finally, David Sirota himself, who was interviewed by Amy Goodman this morning in an article again last November after Rauner's election in the International Business Times, entitled "Illinois Blocks Release of Info About Which Firms Are Managing $3 billion of Public Money." And what it comes down to is that these hedge firms combine themselves into even larger investments that kind of are not, they're called fund of funds, which are not required to divulge how this public pension money, the savings of public employees, is being invested. And again, to conclude, David Sirota has published a report through his group out in Colorado, where Amy Goodman was interviewing this morning, called "The Plot Against Pensions," and he talks about the Pew Charitable Trust. There's something called there's another person named Arnold. You can read about in this report, "The Plot Against Pensions," the Pew-Arnold campaign to undermine America's retirement security and leave taxpayers with the bill. And I would just conclude by saying this all needs to be put, of course, in a much larger context of finance capitalism, of neoliberalism, of the financialization of our economy, of the fact that what's happened in the last 40 years is that Wall Street has made sure that it gets its greasy hands and takes its cut of every aspect of our economy and our savings that we possibly can. The best way to fund a general, meaningful, subsistence or beyond subsistence level public pension would be through a transfer program like Social Security, which takes the wealth that is being produced on a year-to-year basis and appropriates it to retired people so they can choose to save and we can choose to have responsible pension funds. But that what's happened instead in the last 30, 40 years, especially in the last 20 to 30 years, is that people have been increasingly panicked about saving for their retirement, that both private and public pensions have made increasingly risky investments in Wall Street, which of course Wall Street was happy to accommodate in doing, especially during the good times. But of course, part of the residual effects of this is when Wall Street crashes, then these same people who want to raid public pensions want to use that as an excuse to cut back not only the pension payments but overall government. So this is part of a very vicious and very determined effort over the last 30 or 40 years to really change the nature of the system in which we are operating. It is systematic. It's fundamental. It's something that I think we're kept from understanding by the mainstream media, but which people certainly can understand if it's explained properly. And again, that's something I think we have to be doing.
Thank you very much, David. Does the proprietor of the Illinois World Labor Hour have a response to this, David?
Wow, that's really great. In fact, I want to get that hard copy from you, David, after the program. You know, I hate to say this. I hate being right sometimes. I warned about this 15 years ago, and I wonder about that figure, David, because when I kind of did some research on this 15 years ago, the figure was $3 trillion back then in the early 2000s. So I'm thinking it's even higher than that.
In public pensions.
Well, in all union pensions, public and private as well.
Okay, so well, they're just talking. I think this is a figure about public pensions.
All right.
Yeah.
But I warned about this, and of course I was ridiculed and laughed at, saying, "Oh, you don't know what you're talking about." And there has to be a fiduciary responsibility and all this other. You know what? What I've always advocated is that unions. Can you imagine what kind of power the combined unions could do with $3 to $5 million in investments out there? I mean, they could target companies. They could invest only in good companies. More importantly, they could take a lot of that money and invest it in the local communities to where their workers live to actually produce more union jobs. This could be a very powerful economic and political tool. And you know, let's face it. You know, they're not only after state workers' pensions. They want to get their hands on Social Security. And they also want to get a hold of pension plans like what I have, which is a joint union-managed pension fund that's regulated by ERISA, which is a federal pension management entity in the federal government. Well, lo and behold, just as of 6 months ago, they passed a law to where they changed the requirements of ERISA to where now they've loosened the requirements that they don't basically a pension plan like I'm part of, which is a joint union employer administered one, now don't have the same stringent regulations to pay out a set amount of money every month. Now, I haven't been affected by it yet, but the potential's there. I mean, let's face it, pigs will be pigs, and Wall Street, being the greedy pigs they are, they're going to do they're always going to try to gobble up whatever money they can. And of course, by buying off politicians, that makes their job even easier. But yes, I mean, there's not just economic ramifications to it, there's political ramifications too, because you think about it, if they get what they want, they get a hold of this money, it's going to adversely affect the economic security of lots of older Americans, which will basically, you think about it, further disenfranchises your average American to do anything but try to survive. In other words, they won't have time or energy to fight back politically, which is part of the whole program here.
Thank you, David. You're watching News from Neptune. We are running out of time. I wanted to turn to one other story this week that in some ways I think has gotten obscured by some of the other arguments, both domestic and foreign, and that's the fact that the president has gone to Congress this week and asked for a declaration of war. Now, in fact, he did not put it in those terms because, of course, the U.S. government has busily escaped the requirements of the 1787 Constitution under which we're supposed to work, which requires Congress to issue a declaration of war before the American executive can go off and kill people. Mr. Obama has been killing people cheerfully, as he pointed out in a recent book, throughout his presidency, 5,000 probably by drones alone, and he has been conducting the wars that his Pigany always point out he inherited. Yes, he did inherited them, and he used his inheritance vigorously to expand those wars. Now he says the horror stories from the Middle East require a new authorization for the use of military force against the ISIS group, the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. Now, of course, what's going on here is that the American government is using, as it has before, stories of crisis to follow its long-established policy in the Middle East, which is a policy of American control of the energy sources of the region. If the U.S. controls the energy resources of the Middle East, it has a whip hand over its economic rivals in Europe and Asia, such as Germany and China. People sometimes say that the U.S. can't be involved in killing people in the Middle East for oil because it doesn't need the oil. That's true. It's not access to oil that the U.S. government is interested in. It's rather the control of world oil flows. And we've seen that most dramatically in this last 6 months, where American control of these these oil flows has done more than anything else to hurt the American government's enemies in Europe and Asia, and that is by drawing down the oil price, since the governments of Russia, and Iran, and Venezuela are all dependent upon that oil price. But now what our president tells us is that we have to have a new authorization for the use of military force so he can continue to do what he has been doing. Now, you might scratch your head and say, why didn't we need that before? And the administration answers, oh, well, we had authorizations for use of military force going back to 2001, after 9/11, and 2003, Bush's invasion of Iraq. But the point is that the present danger that the administration cries up is the Islamic State. So now we need a new discussion of how the U.S. will carry on its continuous war in the region. Now, there are a number of good-hearted liberals in America who, the sort of people we were talking about earlier, who say that we have to hold the president's feet to the fire, etc., who are saying, well, of course, what we need is a resolution that will constrain the America's war making in the Middle East, and they happen to have one ready. It's called H.J. House Joint Resolution 30, and it was introduced by Representative Barbara Lee of California, the only person to vote against the earlier authorization for the use of military force. The problem is that if you read that resolution, it turns out to be not a constraint on the war making by the presidency, but an authorization for it. It's a liberal authorization for the war making, with such features as the president has to report on how many civilians he's killed. The president has to promise he won't put American troops themselves into it, just American drones and air power, unless it's really necessary. Reading the text of the resolution is interesting in this way because, of course, what we have here is another example of the genius of the Obama administration, the co-option of the anti-war movement, the co-option of people who are opposed to the war policy of the United States in this generation, for an authorization of that policy. And it is, who was it who suggested "fool me once, shame on you," so to speak? All right, here's the foolishness coming forth from the liberal community in not being willing to admit what the American wars in the Middle East are about, and not being willing to make any effective moves actually to challenge them, rather just the opposite, to find a way to support it. So it's been a difficult week, it seems to me, for American liberals, in that they have got to suggest that, oh, gee, they do have some hesitations about what Mr. Obama is doing, but they really don't count for anything. Takes on... and by the way, just to finish this up, one of the people who saw this most clearly as one of the people that the American government is most concerned about, President Putin of Russia, made a trip to Egypt at the beginning of the week. And he was asked about American attacks on ISIS, American attacks on the Islamic State. And his remarks were particularly important, it seems to me. He said, regrettably, we must note that the actions being undertaken today by the members of the anti-terror coalition, and by that he means the people that the United States have organized to attack ISIS, their strategy and tactics are disproportionate to the scale and nature of the existing threat. Airstrikes alone are not enough to deal with it. What is more, such actions lack legitimacy, since they were not directly sanctioned by the UN Security Council, and in certain cases are taken without the consent of states whose territories are being targeted. Now, that last phrase refers specifically to Syria, because it's the American policy vis-a-vis Syria, our demand for regime change in Syria, that lies behind a good bit of the current tergiversation by the administration. So it's it is another example, one of the worst in a while, it seems to me, of the complete misleading of the American public about what the actually quite consistent American policy in the region is and the reasons for it. Comments, gentlemen?
Go ahead, David.
No, you go ahead.
Okay. So, it's funny because, you talk to people and they say, yeah, we have to do something about ISIS because they torture and behead people. Well, what about Saudi Arabia? Saudi Arabia beheads many, many, many more people than ISIS ever has on a monthly basis. But yet you don't hear about anything about regime change in Saudi Arabia. I mean, that's what I'd like to see happen. I mean, let's face it, Assad of Syria is no great man, nor was Gaddafi in Libya. But look what's happened here with this policy. I mean, because of the invasion of Iraq, because of the destabilization, attempts to destabilize and arm various groups in Syria, is what's created ISIS to begin with. Another brilliant foreign policy result from our rulers in Washington, D.C. and Wall Street. This is just, this is crazy. And, of course, the media lately has been, the corporate media, of course, has done all this stuff about the disgraced journalist Brian Williams and all this and that. Well, what wasn't reported is about Hillary Clinton's Brian Williams moment, which was exposed by Dennis Kucinich here recently, a former Democratic congressman from the Cleveland, Ohio area that was drummed out of the Democratic Party, like Cynthia McKinney before him. And he's exposed that these tapes came out about Hillary Clinton. I mean, unbelievable lies about the lead up to the destruction of Libya. I mean, this is just ridiculous. I mean, all this money that's being spent for all this horrible violence around the world to try to profit the 1% could be much better used here in the United States to do a lot of things that are badly need to be happening here in this country to help American citizens. And not to mention the fact that what money could be left over from that to spend internationally could be used to maybe help people build irrigation projects and dams and agricultural projects instead of sending drones and destabilizing elected governments in other parts of the world. Now, granted, Syria and Libya weren't elected governments, but they weren't neither one of them were as bad as Saudi Arabia, which is supposed to be, quote unquote, our ally. And this is especially disgusting. This recent Saudi king who died, about supposedly what a great man he was. He was a tyrant, a vicious, brutal tyrant. And there's still a lot of questions that former Republican Senator Bob Graham of Florida has been bringing up about Saudi Arabia's involvement in the 9/11 attacks. So if we really want to get to the root of this, let's talk about that. I mean, basically, our government is in general doing things that the average American doesn't want them to do if they knew the whole story.
Exactly.
And not to mention the fact that we're destabilizing governments that have not done any harm to American citizens anywhere. Granted, some of these aren't the best governments in the world, but some of them are democratically elected governments like Venezuela.
And I might just mention there is an excellent article this week on the Counterpunch website about Hillary Clinton and the generation-long war policy of the United States and her intimate involvement with that generation-long war policy. I'll put it on the News from Neptune Facebook page. We have a admiration for what Counterpunch does usually. This is particularly good, I think. Stephen?
So yeah, in the spirit of Hillary Clinton, let me wish everybody a happy Valentine's Day. And News from Neptune, of course, we're all about love, albeit tough love. And as I have to repeat from a couple of weeks ago, sometimes when we don't agree with people that we know, people will construe that it's personal, but of course it's not. And I have to not agree with an article by Belden Fields in the current issue of the Public Eye in which he supports our war against ISIS. Again, I just think we can't, I don't understand how it is that in the midst of everything that goes on, whether it's in Gaza or in Ukraine, that all of a sudden that one thing arises in the world that makes us forgetful of what the means and ends of U.S. foreign policy are, and somehow makes an exceptional case out of a bunch of admittedly ruthless and brutal people who behead people, who all of a sudden become public enemy number one. I don't understand going down that road, and I think that, again, referring to comments made earlier, when we discuss with our progressive friends about what the line is between actually opposing the system as opposed to being co-opted by the system, we have to keep these things in mind.
I think that's vital, and to bring it all back home, as David has already begun to do, the local chapter of Progressive Democrats of America has been seen to be one of the major voices in favor of this co-option of the anti-war movement that the Obama administration is underway with right now. It's unfortunate because these are people who, as David was saying in another case, we have some agreements with. But that's all the more important to make sure that a contradiction based upon finally bad politics hasn't crept into the policy recommendations that we share with these people.
Yeah,
I have a quick question, if I can get it in here real quick, both of you gentlemen. You know, there's been reports even in the corporate media about how ISIS is making all this money from oil revenues. Well, how are they getting the oil out of the country? I mean, how are they getting it out of Iraq and Syria? I understand it's through Turkey. Isn't Turkey supposed to be our ally? I mean, this opens a whole can of worms, so to speak. I'm beginning to think that ISIS is just a created boogeyman by our government that basically...
Where does the Taliban get its money from? I mean,
well, this is the thing. Yes, I think the goal here is not defeat of these horrible, vicious groups, but basically to try to create vicious groups like this to have a reason to intervene in the Middle East and other parts of the world. I seriously believe that. Correct me if I'm wrong.
That's a topic we'll take up next week because it's a topic that we, I'm afraid, take up each week. And I would recommend here Patrick Coburn's book and the comments on it that are being published on it. The only book yet about ISIS, the only detailed book about ISIS is by the longtime Middle East reporter for The Independent in London, Patrick Coburn, and his book, what is it?
It's called, are you referring to the one called The Jihadi's Return?
Exactly, that's it.
And if you can't afford it, I'll send it to you.
It's an important book. You have been watching News from Neptune, and I'm Carl Estabrook, and my discussants have been David Green and David Johnson. Our thanks to director and producer Jason Liggett. Upcoming programs here on UPTV include Labor's Worldview, Sunday at 4 p.m. with David, and more news from outside the bubble, as Harry Shearer says, that you can't hear elsewhere in Champaign-Urbana. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere, what's past is prologue, what to come and yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.